Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome. Thanks for coming. Things are going to start getting interesting in Germany from here on out. We've been talking about Prussia, as you can see. And Prussia is interesting in the history of Germany because Prussia evolved into Germany. The modern nation of Germany that we know today as Germany occurred as a result of Prussian history. All right? And we've been talking about Prussia, but it's going to happen today, I think. It's going to happen today because today, during the reign of William I, he appointed as chancellor probably the most interesting person of the late 19th century. All right? I can't say the whole 19th century because in the early 19th century, we had that guy named Bonaparte. As historians go and a number of books written, and I would have to say Napoleon probably takes the cake as far as the most interesting person of the 19th century. A very interesting century, by the way, particularly as far as Europe is concerned. But certainly Otto von Bismarck dominated the 19th century. And so we're going to spend some time talking about him. He was known as the Iron Chancellor, father of modern Germany. His favorite expression was that the major issues of the day will be settled not by debates, not by votes, but by blood and iron. And then he set out to prove it. Those are his birth and death dates, by the way. The other dates are not birth and death dates because, as I told you at the beginning of this class, for royalty, when I put the dates up, the beginning and ending dates are always the beginning and ending dates of their reign. But he's not royalty. He's a common, ordinary, everyday person with common, ordinary, everyday blood flowing through his veins. He was a Junker. How do I know he was a Junker? Because he's got that von in his name. And they were pleased to add that little preposition von in their name, Otto von Bismarck. So those are his birth and death dates. He was born on April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1815 in Schönhausen. His family's estate in the old Prussian province of Brandenburg, now Saxony-Anhalt it's called, just west of Berlin. His father, Ferdinand von Bismarck, was a landowner and a former Prussian military officer. His mother, Wilhelmina Mencken, originally belonged to a pretty well-off, once again, commoner family. He had several siblings, but only an elder brother and a younger sister, her name was Malvina, survived to adulthood. Bismarck was educated at Johann Ernst Plummen's elementary school and the Friedrich Wilhelm and Klaus Kroster secondary schools. From 1832 to 1833, he studied law. Here he is at the age of 21 at the University of Göttingen, I don't know how you pronounce that, just pardon my German. And then he enrolled at the University of Berlin, and he was there from 1833 to 1835. At Göttingen, Bismarck became friends with an American student whose name was John Lothrop Motley. Motley, who later became an eminent historian and diplomat while remaining a close friend of Bismarck's, wrote a novel in 1839 titled Morton's Hope, or the Memoirs of a Provincial, about what life was like in a German university. In it, he described Bismarck as a reckless and dashing eccentric, but also as an extremely gifted and charming young man. Although Bismarck hoped to become a diplomat, he started, as I said, his practical professional training as a lawyer in Aachen and in Potsdam. But he soon resigned that, having first placed his career in jeopardy by taking, an unauthorized leave to pursue two pretty English girls he met. One, the niece of the Duke of Cleveland, and the other, the daughter of a wealthy clergyman. He also served in the army for a year and became an officer in the Landwehr, the reserve, as it was called in Germany, before returning to run the family estates at Schönhausen back upon his mother's death in his mid-20s. It was because of his mother's death in 1839 that Bismarck took over the management of his family estates in Pomerania. About 8 years later, he returned to Schönhausen, where he took up local politics. He married a noble woman whose name was Johanna von Puttkamer in 1847. Like Puttkamer, he became a pietist Lutheran. Pietism is a movement within Lutheranism that combines an emphasis on biblical doctrine with the let's call it the Reformed emphasis on individual piety, hence the name Pietism, while striving to live a vigorous Christian life. Although it at first affected only Lutheranism, it soon spread its influence to other Christian sects beginning in the late 17th century Germany. Anyway, after their long and happy marriage produced one daughter, Marie, and two sons, Herbert and Wilhelm, all of whom survived into adulthood. He also had a hand in the upbringing of an orphaned neighbor, Valley von Blumenthal, whom he called my Sunday's child. In the year of his marriage, Bismarck, who was 32 at the time, here's a picture of Bismarck at 32, Bismarck was chosen as a representative to the newly created Prussian legislature, which I talked about a little bit last time. There he gained a reputation as a royalist, a supporter of royalty and the monarchy, and he was somewhat of a reactionary politician. For example, he often advocated the idea that the monarch had the divine right to rule, divine right monarchy, which was, this goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, that philosophy. In March of the next year, Prussia faced a revolution. We talked about that last time too, one of the revolutions of 1848, which shook many European nations, which, as we discussed, completely overwhelmed King Frederick William IV. The monarch, though initially inclined to use armed forces to suppress the rebellion, ultimately succumbed to the revolutionary movement, you will recall, which brought about the estrangement between he and his brother, William, or Wilhelm, later William I or Wilhelm I. He offered numerous concessions to the liberals. For example, he promised to promulgate a constitution, agreed that Prussia and other German states should merge into a single nation, and appointed a liberal, Ludolf Kamphausen, as minister president. The liberal victory, however, was short-lived, and it ended late in 1848. The movement became weak due to fighting amongst its own factions, the liberal factions, while the conservatives regrouped, gained the support of the king, and retook control of Berlin. Although a constitution was still granted, its provisions fell far short of the demands of the revolutionaries. The next year, in 1849, he was elected again to the lower house of the new Prussian legislature. At this stage in his career, he opposed the unification of Germany, arguing that Prussia would lose its independence in the process, demonstrating what many felt all along, that he saw himself more as a Prussian than as a German, which was not unusual in Prussia at that time. He accepted his appointment as one of Prussia's representatives to the Erfurt Union, which I talked about last time too, an assembly of German liberals that met briefly in 1850 to discuss plans for union, the German unity. Bismarck accepted the appointment, but only in order to oppose that body's proposals more effectively. The parliament, in any event, failed to bring about unification, for it lacked the support of the two most important German states at the time, Prussia and Austria. In 1852, Frederick William IV appointed Bismarck as Prussia's envoy to the Diet, the assembly of the German Confederation in Frankfurt. His 8 years in Frankfurt were marked by changes in his political opinions. No longer under the influence of his ultra-conservative Prussian friends, Bismarck, now at the age of 48, became less reactionary and more moderate. He became convinced that Prussia would have to ally itself with other German states in order to countervail Austria's powerful influence at this time. Thus, he grew more accepting of the notion of a united German nation. In 1858, 6 years later, as we discussed earlier, Frederick William suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed and mentally disabled. His brother, William, took over the government of Prussia as regent. Shortly thereafter, Bismarck was replaced as the Prussian envoy in Frankfurt. He was instead made Prussia's ambassador to Russia. This was a promotion in his career, as Russia was one of the two most powerful neighbors of Prussia at the time, the other being Austria, of course. Other changes were made by the regent, Helmut von Moltke. These three guys we're going to be talking about a lot lately. That's the guy on the left is Bismarck, of course. Helmut von Moltke is on the right, and the other one is Albrecht Graf von Roon. We'll be talking about him later too. He's the guy in the center. But Moltke was appointed the new chief of staff of the Prussian army, and von Roon in the center was appointed Prussian minister of war and given the job of reorganizing the Prussian army. Over the next 12 years, this triumvirate would radically transform not only Prussia, but Europe and the world. Bismarck lived in Russia when he was appointed ambassador there, as I said. He lived in St. Petersburg, the capital at the time, for 4 years, during which time he befriended his future adversary, the Russian Prince Alexander Gorchakov. In June of 1862, he was sent to Paris so that he could serve as the Prussian ambassador to France. Despite his lengthy stay abroad, Bismarck was not entirely detached from German domestic affairs. He remained well informed thanks to his close friendship with the guys in the picture there, von Roon, and so forth. But the true story on Bismarck is his domestic political maneuverings. He was a master at it. Here he is again at the age of 48 in 1863. Bismarck is somewhat of an enigma. If you want to, people always ask, was he a liberal? Was he a conservative? Was he a progressive? Was he a monarchist? You're going to get yourself in trouble if you attempt to put him in a cubbyhole like that, because he changed. He moved. He was not an ideologue, okay? The true story, he's often depicted as a quintessential conservative and reactionary, and there certainly were instances where one could easily draw this conclusion. Yet in his long career, there were many instances when the conservatives wanted nothing to do with him, and the liberals accepted him with open arms. The truth is, he was not an ideologue, as I said, nor a polemicist. He can best be described, and often described himself, as a realist. What he meant by that, nobody knows, but he was also a pragmatist. Pragmatists they don't care about polemics, they don't care about different ideologies. What they care about is what works. Indeed, he is often portrayed as one of the principal examples of a term we used a couple of times before, realpolitik. Realpolitik was a popular term in the late 19th century used to describe statesmen who are willing to seek practical solutions to the major issues and problems of the day, often involving diverse ideologies. Often these practical solutions involved war. It was a dangerous world back in those days. We're going to be talking about several wars today, or the threat thereof. Perhaps its best definition is the one offered by the man who coined the word in the first place, Ludwig von Rothschild, who said, and I quote, "The study of the powers that shape, maintain, and alter the state as the basis of all political insight and leads to the understanding that the law of power governs the world of states, just as the law of gravity governs the physical world." Unquote. It might sound somewhat Machiavellian, but an exponent, a person who believes in realpolitik would argue, well, there are some things we don't like about gravity either, do we? Every time I go to the doctor and he has me step on that damn scale, I don't like gravity. Okay? Got something against it right then and there. But there are things we don't like about power politics either. But sometimes it's there. You can argue all you want for or against it, or whether it's good or bad, but it's there. So you're wasting your time if you think you're going to change it. That's what they would say. But it's probably the ideologues who feel that way, since pragmatism, by its very definition, rejects ideology. Cavour, the father of Italy, talked about him last time. We'll talk about him again. In fact, I'm going to run through the whole Cavour story again today. Was certainly another example of realpolitik. The crowning achievement of Bismarck's career is the unification and creation of the modern state of Germany, which at that incredible moment in history instantly changed world history forever, as the carefully crafted balance of power was upset, since Germany instantly became probably the most powerful nation on earth. At least for a while. Bismarck's tactics to achieve this goal is a study in realpolitik, with its pragmatism and patience, not to mention an ingenious display of statesmanship played out over a 7-year period from 1864 to 1871. Either that, or he was the recipient of tremendous good luck, as events around him played directly into his hands, which is why those who don't like him call him an opportunist. I guess that's somewhat of a pejorative, because it suggests that what happens doesn't happen because of you. You didn't cause these events to happen. You just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and you were able to take advantage of them. Okay? The balance of the rest of his career was spent trying to preserve those gains against one nation's revenge and, ironically, protect the chief benefactor of the founding of modern Germany, who became Emperor Wilhelm II. The two did not like each other. In this, he would ultimately fail, although mostly through no fault of his own. So let's see how he did it. How did he do this? Primarily, he fought three short wars. The Danish War of 1864, which lasted 8 months. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866, which lasted 2 months and 9 days. And the most important one of all, a war we've talked about before, so we won't spend quite as much time on it this time, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, which lasted 9 months and 14 days. All three wars contributed mightily to the process of German unification and played into Bismarck's hands by serving up an opportunity for him to be an opportunist, as I just mentioned. It would be an oversimplification to just say he caused everything to happen, because he did not. But when these situations presented themselves, he knew, he was able to sense the long-range ramifications of actions that he might take to influence these events. Like a grandmaster at chess, Bismarck was always 8 or 10 steps ahead of his opposition. Okay, so let's take a look at these three short wars. The Danish War of 1864. The Danish War was brought about by a succession crisis. Here we go again. How many succession crises have we run into in European history so far? It makes you wonder why they wanted a monarchy in the first place, but I explained why they did. Anyway, this time we're in Denmark. Frederick VII of Denmark died without a male heir. A stupid thing to do, but you can't blame him. Earlier treaties had established the crown being passed through the female line. German states don't like passing the rule through the female line. In fact, many of them forbade it. Okay? But kind of like when Maria Theresa came along, her father, remember the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713? he got everybody to agree that they're going to switch over to the female line here, just to keep the peace. It won't work, but they tried. Which made Christian of Glücksburg the new king. But the waters were muddied by a rival claimant, of course, in the person of Frederick of Augustenburg. Now, the Augustenburgs had a long-standing claim on the duchies of Schleswig-Holstein. Hard to say that. You all been to Denmark? Here's a map of Schleswig-Holstein, which is how these two little areas became the flashpoint of this war, which is sometimes called the War of the Danish Succession. This is Schleswig, and this is Holstein. This is the Danish peninsula, okay? You've all been to Denmark. It's a peninsula, Jutland, because it juts up into the North Sea, right? Where's Copenhagen? I don't know, it's not on there? Copenhagen, is that on an island? Yeah. It's on an island here somewhere? This island or this island? Somewhere around there. Maybe it's further north. I think a later map has it. Once again, I have to point out, the earlier discussed concept of nationalism will play a major role in this war. Nationalism, large groups of people who share the same culture, want their own nation. Okay, nationalism. The population of Schleswig-Holstein was made up of two groups, Danes and Germans. The Danes were in the northern part. Danes were up here, and Germans were down here. Okay? The two groups did not mix. They did not believe in diversity. Okay? They wanted to be by themselves with people like them. The Danes, as I said, lived in the north next to Denmark. Makes sense. And the further south you go, the population becomes more and more German. You see the black line on the map? This black line kind of draws, anybody got any extra batteries? The black line kind of marks the point where you become more German than Danish. More Danish to the north, more German to the south. However, these Germans included both those who leaned toward Austria and those who liked Prussia. So boy, do we have problems here. But the two groups, as I said, didn't mix, but therefore the whole succession mess is going to blow up when the new Danish king said that he would annex all of Schleswig-Holstein to Denmark. To Denmark. And both Austria and Prussia went to war to prevent this from happening. Pardon me? Which king was that? That what? Denmark. The new one, what's his name? Frederick. Was it Frederick? Within 8 months, Denmark had lost both duchies and that were given to both Austria and Prussia to occupy for the time being. The Prussian chief of staff, von Moltke, you saw his picture a little while ago, was naturally very upset at this. The Habsburgs, who rule Austria, the Habsburgs would have a piece of territory bordering Prussia's northern flank. He didn't want this. Bismarck had to play the role of the cooler head to prevail in order to avoid the ire of all the other German states if Prussia had just outright, unilaterally marched into the two duchies and took them over, which he probably could have done. He suspected that Prussia's time would come later, which it did. In the next year, hence the role of patience in his realpolitik. This was the first war in which a civilian conducted the strategy on behalf of Prussia. He was a civilian. It won't be the last. In fact, When his generals protested his meddling, Bismarck reminded them that the army had no business interfering in the politics of the nation. This in itself was a remarkable declaration given Prussia's military history. Many in the army and on the government, in the government bided their time when they could set the ship of state right. But in the exhilaration of victory, all this was pretty much forgotten. So both the Austrian and the German part were annexed by Germany. Okay? So you see how that war helped lead to German unification. Next comes the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Now here's a map we can go by. This is what the Prussia had already just annexed. That's Schleswig-Holstein. Schleswig up here, Holstein down here. And the dark-colored areas you see there is Prussia at this point. After the Danish War of 1864, it looked like the joint occupation of Schleswig-Holstein would usher in a new era of cooperation. This is before they took it all over. Between the two Uber-German powers, Prussia and Austria. This was especially true for Austria, and Bismarck did his best to encourage their hopes. In a note sent to the Prussian ambassador to Vienna, he wrote, and I quote, for Austria, a true German policy is only possible if both Austria and Prussia are united and take the lead. From this high standpoint, an intimate alliance of two powers has been our aim from the outset. If Prussia and Austria are not united politically, Germany does not exist, unquote. Well, judging from subsequent events, this was pure diplomatic hogwash. And he knew it at its highest or lowest, however you want to look at it. By now, Bismarck had already planned to annex Schleswig-Holstein to Prussia and eliminate any Austrian objection through war if necessary. Since the Austrians realized that they were at a geographic disadvantage because Austria's way down here, and in order for them to protect their part of Holstein here, they would have to, well, they'd have to march through Prussia, and that's just not going to happen. Okay? They decided, since they were at such a disadvantage at this point, they decided to negotiate with Bismarck and Prussia, and they would offer Prussia a choice of two options. Either recognize the two duchies as separate states under the Augustenburg dynasty, or annex them to Prussia and compensate Austria with territory in Silesia. Remember Silesia? Way back when Frederick the Great took it from Maria Theresa. Rich in natural resources, many factories, and even rich agricultural land. Bismarck obviously rejected both options and directed the Prussian army to exert more and more influence on the duchies, much to the dismay of Austria. The crisis was deferred when Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph sent a personal ambassador to Berlin to negotiate with William I. An agreement was reached in which Schleswig would be occupied by Prussia and Holstein by Austria. Bismarck agreed with the proposal, but only to buy time while the Prussian military built up its strength. Actually, the Austrian army fought better in the Danish War, and certain reforms had to be enacted in Prussia to prevent this from ever happening again. As Prussian provocations continued, Berlin seized upon the pro-Augustenburg meeting in Holstein and resolved that any war between the two German powers was now inevitable. In the meantime, Bismarck busied himself making alliances and assurances with Italy, France, and Russia. It became obvious that the southern German states would support Austria and the German Confederation. The southern German states are these states right here. Come on, these guys right here. Right here. Okay? Let me try my other. These states right here. Okay? Those are the southern German states, which would support Austria, because they didn't like, they were scared to death of Prussia and this guy running Prussia at the time, von Bismarck. As the Prussians marched against Austria, the southern states and Saxony had to be fought and occupied too. As the war began, most prognosticators actually picked Austria to win. Even though Prussia enjoyed a slight advantage in numbers, but Austria had the support of most all the other German states that I just circled there in the south. Kind of shows you how the war, the pink color represents the supporters of Austria, and the light blue represents, so all this area probably would have supported Austria, and the light blue probably supported Prussia. Okay? So why did Prussia win, if this is the case? Bismarck's famous support of most all of the other, I mentioned a little while ago, the blood and iron. Didn't I mention that at the beginning? His thing about refers to Prussia's industrial might, which certainly played a major role in the struggle, but it was not the deciding factor. The principal Austrian ally was the German Confederation in the north, but their armies had really never trained or fought together and were in no shape to take on the now highly trained and equipped Prussian army. Von Moltke unleashed a new strategy that broke up his army into smaller fighting units, mobile enough to be moved to the point of attack. These units were equipped with one of the first successful breech-loading guns. Recently tested and employed in the American Civil War. You know the difference between a breech-loading and a muzzle-loading gun. The first rifles, long guns, the first rifles, in order to load them, you had to carry with you a supply of powder and a supply of bullets. And you had to first put the powder in, and then you had to take out this long rod and tap the powder down so it's all compact down at the bottom. And then you had to pull the ramrod back out, and then you put the bullet in, usually wrapped with a little piece of cloth, and just put it in the barrel, and then you took the ramrod and pushed the barrel down so it sits on top of the powder. And then you pull the ramrod out again, and there's a little sling underneath the barrel that you could put it in. And then you had to go back to the breech part of the gun where now the bullet, and you had to pull out back the hammer, or the lock as it was called, and you had to put a piece of primer in there. And then when you pulled the trigger, that hit a piece of flint, caused a spark, which ignited the primer, which ignited the gunpowder, which propelled the bullet out through the barrel. And the whole process took about half to a minute to get one shot off while the enemy's charging you. Okay, but they're using the same gun too, so they've got the same problem. Whereas with a breech loader, you have this bullet, powder, primer, are all in a shell. And all you have to do is open the breech by pulling back this thing, and this opens up. I think it would be this area right here. And you put the shell in and close it and fire. And then pull it back, and that ejects the shell, and you put another shell in, close it and fire. And pull it back, and that ejects the shell, and put another one in there, and you could get off 20, 30 rounds in a minute if you're good at it, and you presumably have had a lot of practice at it. That was part of your military training. Breech loaders were far and away the way to go. Okay? If the enemy has muzzle loaders and you have breech loaders, you have a tremendous advantage. The Prussians called them needle guns. I don't know why, probably because the little pin that fires was like the end of a needle. This new weapon, 3 to 5 times faster than a muzzle loader. Now the muzzle loaders that the Austrians were using were more accurate, but at this stage, speed was more important. Speed was more important. The decisive battle was fought at Königsgrätz on July 3rd, 1866, exactly 3 years after our decisive battle of the Civil War was fought at Gettysburg. On the 22nd, Franz Joseph calculated that the war was over. Austria was spared any loss of territory, but had to agree to the dissolution of the German Confederation and the creation of a new Prussian-dominated North German Confederation to the north of the River Main. Prussia secured carte blanche authority to annexations as it pleased. Of course, it wasn't quite one-sided because Bismarck at this point did not want to annex any German states that didn't want to be annexed. Okay? And this was all with the exception of Saxony, who was Austria's faithful friend through all of this. This is where Schleswig-Holstein was annexed to Prussia, along with part of Hesse-Darmstadt and all of Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, and the city of Frankfurt. Okay, German dualism of Austria and Prussia was no more. The victory at Königsgrätz over Austria left the old Prussian parliamentary liberal bloc in an impossible situation. They had almost always opposed Bismarck and his attempts to reform the military. An Austrian indemnity of 40 million florins restored the government's liquidity and made all but impossible, and frankly, they looked a little ridiculous, the liberals did, trying to dispute the legitimacy of the terms proposed by of the government's reforms. Even many of the leaders of the liberal camp were moved by Prussia's success. Many liberals now saw national unity on the terms proposed by Bismarck as the basis for a far more rational political order that would open the door to further political and constitutional progress. As it turns out, they would be right, but they never foresaw the willingness of Bismarck to help them. Okay, Bismarck recognized that the time had come to knit the Prussian political system back together. Liberalism was too important and potentially fruitful a political force to be marginalized forever. In conceding this, Bismarck revealed himself to be a true executor of the post-revolutionary settlements of the 1850s. There was, much to the chagrin of backwoods conservatives who wishfully claimed Bismarck as one of their own, no coup against the Constitution. The Constitution was left intact. In fact, a long-awaited indemnity bill freeing all those imprisoned during the riotous post-revolutionary years, mostly liberals, was now offered to the Parliament. This amounted to an open acknowledgement that the government had acted illegally during the crisis years of the Revolution. It also provided a means of reaffirming the authority of Parliament and getting the boat of the Constitution back on an even keel. These and other shrewdly devised concessions by Bismarck sufficed to dissolve the already fragile unity of the liberal opposition. There was a growing stream of defections from the ranks of the parliamentary progressives still holding out against Bismarck. Defectors such as Karl Twiston, who had been shot in the arm only 4 years earlier in a duel with the chief of the military cabinet, were warmly welcomed by Bismarck, who disarmed any, no pun intended, who disarmed, I guess it would be somewhat of a pun, I don't know, the poor guy shot in the arm, who disarmed any residual doubters by drawing them respectfully into consultations over further concessions to the liberal interests. Under the pressure of this accommodation between Bismarck and the moderate opposition, the liberal front that had coalesced during the earlier constitutional crisis had finally come undone. A cleavage opened between those national liberals who saw in national unity a more rational political order, and those progressives who focused instead on the issues of liberty, socialism, and parliamentary powers that had been at the heart of this constitutional conflict. Bismarck, ironically, was forced to fight a rearguard action against die-hard conservatives who opposed any concessions to the liberals. In fact, many on both sides of the political spectrum criticized Bismarck for his multitasking abilities. Here's a political cartoon mocking Bismarck's many roles that he played, him in the middle with all the different modes of dress and uniforms and so forth. With the victory of 1866, the long history of Prussia's contest with Austria over hegemony over the German states finally came to an end. A solid block of Prussian territory stretched between France and Belgium in the west and Russia and Lithuania in the east. Prussia now encompassed over 4/5 of the North German Confederation. The southern states of Hesse-Darmstadt, Baden, Württemberg, and Bavaria escaped annexation, but were forced to sign alliances that brought them into Prussia's sphere of influence. But actually, there was still no Germany. It still said Prussia on the map. Okay? For the time being. Which brings us to the most important war, and that's the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. By this time, non-Austrian and Prussian Germany was divided into North and South. This is Prussia in the north in red, and those are the southern states. I just named them in the south. The biggest one being, of course, this one, Bavaria. Bavaria. Right here is Munich. Yet, at the same time, and by the same time I mean around 1866, Bismarck confided to a close associate, the Grand Duke of Baden, that union between North and South was only a matter of time. Yet, at this time, he said that it was not certain that it would ever happen. He had his doubts. There was tremendous anti-Prussian feeling throughout the southern German states. Austria was still held on to the fading hope that they could undo what happened in 1866. The Austrian foreign minister tried to cement an alliance between Austria, the southern states, and France, thinking that would isolate Prussia. In Württemberg and Bavaria, public opinion was vehemently opposed to any form of union with Prussia. And in 1869, parliamentary elections produced solid anti-liberal majorities opposed to even a small German union with Prussia. In Catholic Bavaria, the clergy circulated petitions at Mass on Sunday, garnering hundreds of thousands of signatures condemning Prussia. Bismarck seemed to take all this in stride, as if he knew it was going to happen, while at the same time watching for an opportunity to act. As early as the summer of 1866, he publicly observed that war with France would threaten all of Germany. Therefore, he would not want a war with France. That would weaken all of Germany. At the same time, there was serious speculation that France may indeed try to use force to change the outcome of the Austro-Prussian War we just discussed. It had only been a little over 50 years since Napoleon Bonaparte marched on Europe, and it was no secret that his nephew, Louis Napoleon, now ruling as Napoleon III of France, wanted to resurrect the French Empire of his uncle. As time went on, the notion that a security threat from France began to occupy more and more of Bismarck's thoughts. Napoleon III was shocked at Prussia's success in 1866 and was convinced that Prussia was a threat to French interests. It is at this stage that once again something just fell into Bismarck's lap. It would be a mistake once again to credit Bismarck with any genius here, but not a mistake to call him an opportunist for taking advantage. At least he had the skill and knowledge to recognize it when it came, and for that we have to give him credit. The opportune issue that presented itself was occasioned by the deposition of the Queen of Spain, Isabella II. You remember Isabella? Okay. You recall that she had actually been exiled in 1868. There was a little mini revolt in Spain. There were many, many revolts in Spain. Fleeing to Paris in the company of both her husband and lover. As I joked at the time, I don't think I got very many laughs, but as I called it at the time, the original ménage à trois. Well, that's better than what I got last time. Thank you. Anyway, she formally abdicated in 1870. The crown of Spain was offered to the Catholic Prince Leopold, who was a Habsburg. He was a Hohenzollern. A Hohenzollern, the same family that all these Prussian kings are from. Napoleon III let it be known that he would take serious exception. Way to go, Napoleon III. Tell him how you feel. He would take serious exception should a German, which is what Napoleon was, especially one related to the ruling family of Prussia, inherit the kingdom of Spain, and even threatened war to stop that from happening. Bismarck immediately saw this as an opportunity to create friction with France and immediately became an ardent supporter of Leopold's candidacy. He could care less who the King of Spain was going to be, but he pretended to love Leopold. This caused national outrage in France. In a bellicose speech to the French Parliament, the new foreign minister promised that Leopold would never be allowed to assume, and he said, the throne of Charles V, who, by the way, was a Habsburg, a German. It wouldn't be the first speech by a politician who didn't know history. I shall not name names. Okay? A reference to the 16th century when German Habsburgs had threatened to encircle France. The French ambassador was ordered to Bad Em, where Emperor William was, he was taking a vacation there. That's where the baths are. The baths, Europeans love the baths. Okay. To try to convince the Prussian king to withdraw Leopold's candidacy for the Spanish throne. Since William I responded in a conciliatory manner, actually William didn't care that much who the new king of Spain was going to be. Spain by this time was a nobody, on the verge of losing a war to the United States, a war they had no business being in. Since William responded in a conciliatory manner, the French ambassador's request and eventually accepted that Leopold must renounce his claim to the Spanish throne. The matter might simply have ended there with a minor diplomatic victory for Paris and Napoleon III. But the French foreign minister, exuding a great deal of hubris, pretty proud of himself for being able to swing this, made a serious tactical error. He sent the ambassador back to the emperor to demand a further and much more far-reaching assurance that the Prussian king would never, at any time in the future, support Leopold. But demanding that the Prussian monarch tie his hands in perpetuity was a step too far. And William responded with a polite, no thank you. But demanding that the Prussian monarch tie his, when Bismarck received the king's telegrammed response, immortalizing in what is sometimes called the Ems telegram or the Ems dispatch, summarizing the substance of the meeting, he saw immediately that an opportunity had arisen to insult the French, which, by the way, is always, always easy to do. They are a very, very proud people. And anytime you run into a very, very proud person, it's always easy to insult them because virtually no matter what you say is going to insult them. Okay? So, what Bismarck did on July 13th, he issued a lightly edited version of the text in which William's refusal was made to appear as a brusque rebuff, and the French ambassador a pertinent petitioner. French newspaper translations over the next few days made it even look worse and were leaked on July 14th. July 14th, Bastille Day, the national holiday of France. Okay? They shoot off fireworks, invite friends over for barbecued hamburgers and homemade ice cream, just like we do on our... okay, all right, you got the idea. The French government, anticipating an explosion of national outrage, responded by mobilizing their army on the following day, and a declaration of war followed shortly thereafter. Here, as in 1864 and 1867, was a political crisis made to order for Bismarck, who understood better than anyone how to exploit the unstable relationship between dynastic mechanisms and the forces of nationalism. Yet Bismarck's skill and cunning, remarkable as they were, can also be deceptive. He was not in control of events, actually. He had not planned the Hohenzollern candidacy, and although he pressed hard for it during the spring and summer of 1870, he was also prepared to step back when it looked as if the Prussian king had agreed to withdraw and was willing to accept a French diplomatic victory and bide his time for a later opportunity. Even to say that the French played into his hands partly misinterprets the situation. For France's readiness to risk war was not the outcome of Bismarck's actions as such, but expressed a principal refusal to countenance any diminution of its privileged place within the European international system as personified by Napoleon III himself. And I forgot to include a picture, but if you ever see Napoleon III in the dictionary where they have pride, they have a picture of Napoleon III right next to it, okay? He had a big mustache. He always wore those flashy French uniforms, and the French were, they were pretty good at designing uniforms. They were pretty impressive. Or the French have a word for it, élan. Élan, pride. The French went to war in 1870 because they believed, reasonably enough, they believed they could win. It would thus be an exaggeration to say that Bismarck planned the war with France. Bismarck was not an exponent of preventative war. It was, as he once remarked, equivalent to, and this is his quote, not mine, shooting yourself in the head because you're afraid to die, unquote. On the other hand, war with France was certainly on his menu of political options, provided that the French took the initiative and acted first. Throughout the whole Spanish crisis, Bismarck operated an open-ended policy that incorporated the possibility of war, but also served other objectives, such as accelerating the integration of the South German states to his side and challenging French pretensions. Excuse me. Had the Ems dispatch merely generated friction and threats from Paris, this too would have served Bismarck's objectives by reminding those Germans in the southern states that they would remain vulnerable until they entered into a union with Prussia. That's why he took his time in all this. He didn't want to act too rashly and quickly because he was afraid those southern German states would interpret this as he's starting the war. He wanted to make it look like the French had started the war, which it pretty much did, because then they still had the memory of Napoleon Bonaparte marching through that area just a few years before. The news of mobilization and the subsequent French declaration of war set off a wave of patriotic emotion in Prussia and the other German states. Were outraged. And, you know, as he returned by train from Baden, William I was mobbed by every station by cheering German crowds. Even the South Germans were outraged by the bellicosity and the arrogance of the French. Plans were already in place to coordinate military operations in the southern German states under the terms set out in their alliances in the North German Confederation. The diplomatic setting was also auspicious, as Vienna was still struggling with the consequences of far-reaching domestic reforms and were reluctant to risk any joint action. As for the Italians, they were unlikely to help Paris, while French troops continued to occupy what remained of the Papal States, thereby preventing the absorption of Rome and its hinterland into the new Kingdom of Italy. Britain had already made its peace with the idea of a unified Germany dominated by Prussia, and the Russians were easily won over by Bismarck's promise that Prussia would support St. Petersburg in revising the most burdensome terms of peace handed to the Russians after the Crimean War, which included the loss of the right of passage through the Bosporus and Dardanelles, making all efforts of Peter and Catherine the Great null and void. Russia could not even put warships in Russian ports on the Black Sea, according to the terms ending the Crimean War. We'll talk about that war when we get to Russia. We'll later when we get there. But suffice it to say that the Crimean War was a most humiliating defeat for the Russians in the 19th century. So there was little reason to fear the Russians would intervene in support of France. Not going to happen, because the French helped the British in the Crimean War. In military terms, the Prussians, as Bismarck suspected, were well placed. Better indeed than most contemporaries were aware. Well placed to win. They had at full force a larger, fitter, and more disciplined army than the French. They also outperformed them in tactics and infrastructure. As in the Austrian War, the superior Prussian military organization was crucial. By contrast, the Prussian-German General Staff, which reported directly to the king, the French General Staff was a mere department in the Ministry of War, and in matters of strategy and tactics, it was always subject to the left-leaning National Assembly. None of this actually made Prussian victory inevitable. For all the efforts of the General Staff, the weaponry of the two sides was more closely matched in 1870 than in the previous conflict that I mentioned. The decisive advantage bestowed by the needle gun in Austria was canceled out in 1870 by the excellent infantry rifle known as the chapeau of the French military, not to mention the mitrailleuse, an early machine gun that sowed havoc wherever it came into action against Prussian troops. By the few French troops that were trained to use it, and there were very few, the Prussians were dogged by the usual misunderstandings and false steps. General Steinmetz once again distinguished himself by his blithe disregard for instructions from the General Staff, and a lot of the early victories were stumbled into rather than planned. Even Moltke made some serious errors, most notably the outset of the campaign when he route marched more than 200,000 men across the French front, exposing his forces to devastating flanking attacks. Fortunately for the Prussians, the French commander failed to seize the opportunity. The Prussians also exploited their marginal superiority, in artillery, with increasing skill using their field guns to draw French fire away from advancing Prussian infantry. Most importantly, perhaps, the Prussians made fewer mistakes than their opponents. I already talked about him. Here's a battle map with the major battles of the war. Here's Paris. Here's the marching on of the Prussian troops on the different dates. The most important battle is right here at Sedan. That's where Napoleon and his army were captured, forced to surrender on September 2nd. After arduous negotiations with the new republic, after all these victories, the Prime Minister Adolphe Thiers, provisional peace was signed at the end of February. The Prussian army, under the terms of the armistice, held a brief victory parade in Paris down the Champs-Élysées on February 17th. The city was silent and draped with black, and the Germans quickly withdrew to just outside the city. Bismarck honored the armistice by allowing trainloads of food because the Germans had surrounded Paris and not letting any food in. They were using hot air balloons to try to get messages and bread into the city from outside. But Bismarck allowed trainloads of food after the withdrawal, after the armistice was signed. And prior to withdrawal from France, agreed to pay 5 billion francs, about $1 billion. At the time, Prussian forces were concentrated in the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. Here's the map. This is Alsace and Lorraine, right here, Alsace and Lorraine. Which was annexed to the new nation of Germany. An exodus occurred from Paris. It's some 200,000 people, predominantly middle class, went to the countryside. It was not until May 10th, 1871, after French forces had crushed the uprise of the Paris Commune, which was rebelling against its own French government because they signed the peace treaty with the Prussians. Otherwise, the Prussians would have destroyed Paris. And the final treaty was agreed at Frankfurt. In the meanwhile, Bismarck had overcome his objections to the southern states and secured their agreement to a union with Prussia to create the German Empire. On January 18th, 1871, a new German empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors. Another thing that the Prussians did to rub a little salt in the wounds of the French, they used the Palace at Versailles. And at the Hall of Mirrors, exactly 170 years to the day after the coronation of Frederick I as Prussian king. Unlike his predecessor, Frederick William IV, however, William I accepted the title of German emperor. Here's Bismarck, and here's the king, William I. Okay? And we now have a new map. This is the unification of Germany. All the colored areas you see there are now part of the German Empire. All of this. These are the southern states that joined. Alsace and Lorraine that were taken away from the French, made part of Germany. And notice the boundary line here is west of the Rhine River. Here's the border, here's the Rhine. Okay? The new German Empire. And as I said, this is a world-changing event. So let's go from there to the post-unity German world. 1871 and 1914. Why did I pick 1914? World War I. Yeah, the Great War, as they called it. Well, for centuries since Charlemagne, let's kind of put what just happened in a little bit of perspective here. Since Charlemagne, Central Europe's German populations had been politically fragmented and therefore weak. Remember this map? Boy, it's a lot smaller than I thought it was going to be. This is Germany. Look how it's all fragmented it is. Italy too. Okay? And yet other nations by now are really looking pretty good, like they look today. The continent was dominated by the states on its periphery whose interest was to maintain the power vacuum at the center. Now, that's why I made it smaller. Now, in 1871, look where Germany is. Germany's united also. For the first time, the center was united and strong. Relations among the European states would henceforth be driven by a new and unfamiliar dynamic. Benjamin Disraeli, leader of the conservative opposition in the House of Commons, saw this more clearly than most, as he said, and I quote, "The war," referring to the Franco-Prussian War, "represents the German Revolution, a greater political event than the French," he declared before Commons. "This is not a single diplomatic tradition that has not been, there is not a single diplomatic tradition that has not been swept away." Unquote. How true these observations would only gradually become clear as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. The era of Austro-Prussian dualism, once the structuring principle of political life among the German states, was over. As early as May of 1871, the Austrian foreign minister recognized the futility of policy containment and advised Emperor Franz Joseph that Vienna should henceforth seek, and once again I quote, an agreement between Austria-Hungary and Prussia, Germany, embracing all current affairs, unquote. The first fruit of this new Austrian outlook was the Three Emperors League of October 1873 between Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany. 6 years later, Bismarck negotiated the more comprehensive dual alliance of 1879 that transformed Austria-Hungary into Germany's junior ally. My, how times have changed. Henceforth, Austrian policy would aim to engage Berlin as deeply as possible in the security interests of Austria-Hungary, even if this meant accepting subordinate status within that relationship. The two states would remain bound to each other until 1918 and the embarrassing end of World War I. The War of 1870 also placed the relationship with France on an entirely new footing. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, strongly advocated by Bismarck, traumatized the French political elite and imposed a lasting burden on, let's say, just Franco-German relations. Alsace-Lorraine became the holy grail of the French cult of revenge, providing the focus for successive waves of France's chauvinist agitation. In fact, a whole wave of French introspection followed that, included a religious revival which suggested France's defeat may have been punishment for the sins of excessive liberalism. In fact, it was at this time that the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur was built on Montmartre to remind Parisians of the need to repent and get even with the Germans at the same time and get back Alsace-Lorraine. Pressing the annexation may well have been the worst mistake of Bismarck's political career, since it ultimately became the first cause of World War I. I used to tell my 10th graders most 10th graders are sports fans, and I know there are a lot of sports fans in here. You know, in baseball, there are written rules and there are unwritten rules. You all know what the written rules are. 3 strikes and you're out, and 4 balls you get to take first base, and so on and so forth. But baseball has been around for so long, it is a game very, very, very rich in traditions. And one of those traditions is that if you have a game won, let's say the score is 10-1, and it's the top of the 9th inning, and you come to bat, your team's got the 10, and the pitcher has the 1, and you get a base hit. You're on first base. Now, let's say you're on first base and you're leading off. Are you going to steal second? Leading 10-1? No, you are not going to steal first base. There's an unwritten rule. If you steal first base, second base, you already got first base, no need to steal it. If you're going to steal second base, you're showing up the other team, you're embarrassing the other team. And the next time you come to bat, be it the next inning, should they come up with 9 runs in their bottom of the 9th inning, or tomorrow, most baseball series is worth 3 games, or next week or next year, the first time you come up to bat against that team again, the very first pitch is going to be a fastball, and it's going to be aimed right here. Okay? I only know of one exception to that rule. It was made in 1962. The Los Angeles Dodgers were in struggle with the San Francisco Giants. They were way ahead. And they had this young shortstop by the name of Maury Wills, who was trying to break Ty Cobb's record of 154 stolen, I think it was 154 stolen bases. And he asked permission of the other players, since I'm in this race to break the stolen base record, may I steal second base and or third base if we've got the game won? And they gave him permission to do that. Baseball is a different game than most of the other games. It really is.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, well, let's wait and see what happens there, huh? Let's wait and see. Remember what the manager said, we did not cheat. We just broke the rule. Anyway, Bismarck embarrassed the French. He showed them up. He took Alsace-Lorraine. He took, 5 billion francs from them. He had the king crowned at Versailles. He rubbed their nose in it. The French, the most proud nation on earth. Okay? And he knew they're going to try to get even. And so for the rest of his time, he's going to do what he can to protect Germany from France and a war of revenge. And that's why he set the first alliance he set with Austria. There will be more to come. Even without the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, the very existence of a new German empire would have transformed the relationship with France. German weakness had been one of the traditional mainstays of French security policy. They never had to worry about the Germans too much because they were all fighting among themselves. Could almost always be counted on in the past several centuries. After 1871, France was bound to seek every possible opportunity to contain this new power on its eastern border. A lasting enmity between France and Germany, despite intermittent efforts on both sides to achieve agreements, was thus, to an extent, pre-programmed into the European international system after the wars of unification that I just discussed. From the French perspective, the chief objective had to be to contain Germany by forming an anti-German alliance. The most attractive candidate for such a partnership was Russia. Why Russia? Because it's on the other side. And if you have an alliance with someone on Germany's other side, that means if war breaks out, they would have to divide their forces in half. And you would only have to face half the German army. Nobody wanted to face the entire German army. They just saw what happened. Okay? Berlin, the most attractive candidate, as I said, was Russia. Berlin could only prevent this by attaching Russia to an alliance system of its own. But any alliance system incorporating both Russia and Austria-Hungary, because they don't like each other, was bound to be unstable, given the recent history of strained relations between the two of late. So having been shut out of Germany and Italy, Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian foreign policy focused increasingly on the Balkans, a region where Vienna's interests conflicted directly with those of Russia. It was tension over the Balkans that broke the Three Emperors League in 1885. Bismarck managed to patch up German relations with Russia by negotiating what came to be known as a reinsurance treaty of 1887, which ensured Russia's neutrality in the event of war with France. See what Bismarck's thinking here? If war breaks out with France, he doesn't want Russia jumping in on France's side. So he signs this reinsurance treaty in which the Russians agreed to remain neutral. They wouldn't fight. And all they had to do was promise to send a few German officers to help train the woefully untrained Russian army. Send them over and show them how to march and shoot guns and all those other things that armies do. Okay? But by 1889, it had become increasingly difficult to reconcile Berlin's commitments to Austria-Hungary with its obligations to Russia. In 1890, Bismarck's successor, Leo von Caprivi, allowed the reinsurance treaty to lapse. You see, oftentimes when nations sign treaties, there's an expiration date on it. Okay? This one had an expiration, I think it was 3 years. France promptly, when it did collapse, France promptly leapt in, offering St. Petersburg generous loans and armament subsidies. The result was the Franco-Russian Military Convention of August 18th, 1892, which morphed into the fully fledged alliance of 1894, both of which clearly envisage Germany as a future enemy. It was to compensate for this adverse development that Germany in turn moved closer to Turkey in the 1890s, freeing Britain from its traditional role as guardian of the Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits, and allowing it, after 1905, to pursue a policy of appeasement with Russia. A bipolar Europe that would go to war in 1914 was now in place. The unfolding of the structural transformation of Europe wrought by Prussia's German Revolution of 1866 to 1871 happened before everyone's eyes. But only Bismarck saw it coming and recognized it once it arrived. Well, Bismarck's career will come to an end in 1890. Bismarck, late in his career, here he is at 75, I've got another one here too, and here's a monument to Bismarck in Berlin. Probably having realized that he had so embarrassed France, he spent most of the rest of his career trying to avoid a war of revenge on the part of France by isolating it diplomatically. The Three Emperors League was the first effort. The Dual Alliance eliminated any attempt on Austria for revenge of 1866. And furthermore, Austria saw that the Dual Alliance with Germany as protection against Russia by tying itself to the might of the united Germany if Russia ever moves against Austria. This made the agreement far more beneficial to Austria than Germany, since there was no threat against the Kaiser from his relative. They were first cousins, I believe, the Tsar in St. Petersburg. Later, he brought in Italy, since it shared a border with France, thus adding a further concern and a measure of isolation to France. But the real stroke of genius was the reinsurance treaty with Russia, which guaranteed Russian neutrality in return for German advisors to help train the Russian army, as I said. However, this treaty had a sunset clause, as I said. I don't know why I'm repeating myself here. But by the time Russia requested its renewal, the new German Kaiser, this is why I'm repeating it, excuse me, the new German Kaiser, William II, decided it was unnecessary since he felt his own personal relationship with the Tsar would keep the peace. Of course, when the treaty lapsed and France would seize the opportunity to form an alliance. When later, in 1904, they brought in Britain to form the Triple Entente, the stage was set, as I said, for World War I. I hadn't mentioned Britain yet, had I? What brought the Brits in? I'll talk about that, I think. On the home front, Bismarck was a master of complex politics, as I said before. He created the first welfare state in the modern world with the goal of gaining working class support that might otherwise have gone to his socialist enemies. In the 1870s, he allied himself with the liberals, who were low tariff and anti-Catholic, and fought the Catholic Church in a culture war. He lost that battle as the Catholics responded by forming a powerful political party called the Center Party, and used their support for universal male suffrage to gain a block of seats in the Reichstag. Bismarck then reversed himself, ended this culture war, broke with the liberals, imposed tariffs, and formed a political alliance with the Center Party to fight the socialists. See, he was a realpolitik. A devout Lutheran, he was loyal to his king, who in turn gave Bismarck his full support against the advice of his king's wife and heir, his heir, the king's son. While Germany's parliament was by now elected by universal male suffrage, it did not have real control of the government. Bismarck distrusted democracy and ruled through a strong, well-trained bureaucracy with power in the hands of a traditional Junker elite that comprised the landed nobility. Bismarck largely controlled domestic and foreign affairs under the elderly William I until he was removed by the young Kaiser William II in 1890. There's a famous political cartoon. That's Bismarck leaving the ship of state while the William II watches him. Bismarck, as I said, an aristocratic Junker himself, had an aggressive and dominating personality, to say the least. He displayed a violent temper and kept his power by threatening to resign time and time again. But he knew the king wouldn't allow that, so he got what he wanted. He possessed not only long-term national and international vision, but also the short-term ability to juggle many complex developments simultaneously. As the leader of what historians called revolutionary conservatism, Bismarck became a hero to German nationalists, and they built hundreds of monuments glorifying their iconic symbol of powerful conservative leadership. Historians generally praise him as a statesman of moderation and balance who kept the peace in Europe and was primarily responsible for the unification of Germany and, of course, the building of its world-renowned bureaucracy and army. He spent his final years composing his memoirs, Thoughts and Memories is what they were called, praised by many as a work of literary genius, but also of somewhat questionable accuracy, in which he increased the drama around every event, and he always presented himself favorably, reminding one of Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, who did the same thing. He died in July of 1898 at the age of 83 at Friedrichsruhe, a house built on land in Schleswig-Holstein given to Bismarck by William I, and by the way, destroyed by the RAF during World War II because they thought that Heinrich Himmler was hiding there. Despite the Red Cross markings on the roof, they bombed it anyway. And this is the house in question, what it looks like today. Bismarck, he continued his feud with William II by embarrassing him in his memoirs and publishing the text of the reinsurance treaty with Russia, which was a breach of national security, since it was a top secret treaty. Obviously, Bismarck has left quite a legacy. One measure, I suppose, is how much geography is named after him. There are no fewer than 3 American cities named after him. One is the state capital, North Dakota. But Missouri and Illinois all have cities of Bismarck. The Bismarck Sea and the Bismarck Archipelago in southwestern Pacific. One strait in Antarctica and one city in Tanzania. Africa, which, by the way, has since been renamed. Huh? He even managed one attack on William II from the grave by having his tombstone inscribed with the words, "Here lies a true servant of Emperor William I." One interesting thing that comes up at this time that I discovered in a recent published book that I acquired, and you know, after you read so many books, you're really looking for something different. And this historian, and I can't remember her name, but the book was quite interesting, and it had a whole chapter on the birth of German anti-Semitism. Now, we all know, I hope you know, because I've mentioned it virtually every chance I've had, we are all so accustomed, and rightfully so, to the, this is something else, to instantly equating in our minds German anti-Semitism with a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler. Well deserved, by the way. But in all actuality, anti-Semitism existed and had for a long time, as we all know, in the history of Europe. And many say it's alive and well in Europe today, judging by some statements of some politicians. has a long and storied history in Europe for centuries before Hitler, or even the person I'm about to name, who shares a great deal of the blame for modern German anti-Semitism. Some scholars even go back to the pre-Christian era and enumerate examples of ancient Greek and Roman anti-Semitism. So it's been around a long time, suffice it to say. Now, you will recall, I lost my cursor. What do I do?
Just keep moving. What do you use, a pad or a mouse?
Pad.
So just, go all the way to the right, all the way to the left.
I am.
It'll show up somewhere.
Oh, wait a minute. There it is. It just showed up. Thank you. Although I was doing that anyway. Just want you to know. You'll recall the many expulsions of the Jews from the new nations of England, France, Spain, Portugal that I have covered in this class. The many organized riots directed against Jewish populations in medieval Europe called pogroms have been mentioned many times. Certainly the Holocaust represents the most serious and determined attempt to murder an entire group of people from society, represents the most horrific form of anti-Semitism in history that gave birth to the word genocide. And since it was Germany who authorized the Holocaust, that is why I understandably choose here to discuss this particular example. Meet Heinrich von Trichtle, 1834-1896. A German historian, political writer, and member of the Reichstag in 1871. When Bismarck formed the alliance with Austria back in 1879, it had a rather unnerving effect on many Prussian leaders who, like Bismarck, considered themselves more Prussian than German, as I mentioned. One of the basic causes of this attitude was that they considered themselves Protestant Germans at the same time, which included decidedly an anti-Catholic bias. This was especially strong in the north and east of the New Germany, but there were other centers of this elsewhere. To them, this dual alliance with Catholic Austria, still ruled by the Catholic Habsburgs, was a slap in the face. Now Germany was obligated to go to war against anyone who attacked Austria. These embittered Germans now saw themselves as members of a new, I'm going to call it an ersatz religion, called Protestant Germanism. Anti-Catholicism came naturally to them, but they immediately adopted another. They didn't feel there were enough anti-Catholics in Germany at the time, so they adopted another hate-based philosophy that would almost triple their numbers and popularity, namely anti-Semitism, prejudice against the Jews. Enter Herr von Trichtle, who became the official proclaimer of this new ism, utilizing his position as the official Prussian state historian. He soon produced an article, the first of many, titled "A Word About Our Jews," which became known as the founding document of modern political anti-Semitism. Here he referred to Jews as, and I quote, "our misfortune." He then linked the Jews to another feared group among many Germans, the English, about whom he had long raged against. He said that, like the English, the Jews were personally degenerate and cowardly, would rather be shopkeepers than heroes, and through deviousness and trickery had somehow managed to rule the world. I guess he missed the supreme irony here. The Jews and the English, he went on, had a secret master plan to rule the world, and only smarter nations like Germany had a chance to stem the tide. every anti-Semite since Tritschke has adopted this conspiracy theory, haven't they? From Kaiser William II, who called Britain Jew England, to certain modern politicians, and I won't mention any names, who call New York Hymietown and refer to its residents as crooked diamond merchants. He also chose Poland for scorn. And here's what he said: from the inexhaustible womb of Catholic Poland came an annual swarm of ambitious young Jewish trouser peddlers, whose children and grandchildren will rule the press and stock exchanges of Germany, unquote. Here he links the fear of an alleged Jewish-English invasion to the traditional Prussian fear of Poland. The Jews were painted as internationalist, money-bagged Englanders and penniless, fast-breeding Polish immigrants all rolled into one. It was then easy for radical Protestants to link these Jews in a dark union with, ironically, the Roman Catholic Church, who, of course, in historical perspective, was a major motivator of the expulsions from Spain, Portugal, and France. As foreigners within an ancient boundaries of Prussia, their motto became, and I quote, "Without Jews and without Rome, we shall build the Cathedral of Germania," unquote. One follower of Tritschke, running for the Reichstag seat, won his election on the slogan, "Jews, Junkers, and priests all belong in the same pot," unquote. In 1893, candidates who identified themselves as anti-Semites, and some did so on the ballot, you know, you get a ballot designation, did so on the ballot. And they were, in 1893, candidates who identified themselves as anti-Semites won 16 Reichstag seats, all of them from Protestant Prussia, Saxony, and Hesse.
And excuse me, how do you spell his name?
I knew someone was going to ask that. Hang on. Hang on. Capital T-R-E-I-T-S-C-H-K-E. Got it?
Can you pronounce it?
I've already done that. As best I could. Tritschke. Yeah. Anyway, they won, all of them from those Protestant areas. Now 16 seats isn't that many in a Reichstag of 300 or 400 or 500. But many, after seeing these results, more than one party panicked and adopted similar anti-Semitic policies. Within a few short years, anti-Semitism became socially respectable at the highest levels. And we all know what followed. Interesting, huh? Interesting and ironic. Let's finish up the Hohenzollerns. Don't know if we have time to do it today, but we'll get started. Well, I know we'll finish this guy, because he didn't last very long. Frederick III only lasted 3 months in office in 1888, and here he is. Don't have a picture of him, but here's that picture at Versailles. This is him standing behind his father here, or yeah, this is him here. Okay. Emperor William I died at the age of 90 in 1888, and his son Frederick William was crown prince for 27 years. But before he, kind of like Prince Charles, but before he inherited the throne, he developed throat cancer, which proved fatal 99 days into his reign. And he was a liberal largely through the influence of his wife, Princess Victoria, the eldest daughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. Frederick admired the British constitutional monarchy. Remember, there was little actual English blood in Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who ruled England as they were both mostly German. In fact, Frederick and Victoria planned to rule Germany just like Victoria and Prince Albert ruled England, as joint consorts. They both looked forward to his reign as he vowed to put Germany on a different path than William I and his chief minister Otto von Bismarck, but any reforms he did enact were later repealed and ignored by his son William II. That's he and his wife here. Now let's get started on William II. Don't know if I'll finish him or not. William II, talk about that was his favorite portrait of himself. Or Wilhelm, if you want to call him Wilhelm, that's German for William, okay? Loved being king and emperor or Kaiser. And why wouldn't he, given the rest of his family? He was the eldest grandson of British Queen Victoria. His mother was Princess Victoria, and related to many monarchs and princes of Europe, three notable contemporary relations being his first cousins, King George V of the United Kingdom, founder of the House of Windsor, Marie, Queen Consort of Romania, and the Tsarina Alexandra of Hesse, consort to his second cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of the House of Romanov, the last ruler of the Russian Empire before the Russian Revolution of 1917, which deposed the monarchy. He was handicapped from birth by a deformed shoulder, which is why he rarely used his left hand and arm, and some have suggested that this infirmity at least partially explains some of his aggressive behavior. He was also somewhat bombastic, flamboyant, and tended to simplify issues as they were presented to him. He saw himself as a decisive ruler who could make the right decisions, but more often than not, he didn't. Confusing decisiveness with impulsiveness. For example, there's a famous story about William that took place during the European tour of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It seems Europeans at this time were enthralled with the American West, of which this entertaining display they believed was an example of what it was really like. One of the most popular parts of the show was a display of the marksmanship of the skills of a very young 5-foot-tall girl by the name of Annie Oakley, who in the act, she would often shot corks out of bottles, snuffed out candle flames, and shot the ashes off of cigarettes. While the Wild West show was performing in Europe in 1890 and in 1891, Crown Prince William visited the show several times and was fascinated watching Annie shoot the ashes off of cigarettes with her husband, Frank Butler, held in his mouth. Intrigued, William asked Annie to shoot his cigarette. Contrary to some legends, Annie put the cigarette in his hand, not in his mouth, for the famous shot. Some people later ventured that if Annie would have shot William and not his cigarette, she could have prevented World War I. In fact, during the war, Annie Oakley sent him a letter to the Kaiser asking for another opportunity. He never answered. He never answered. Well, why don't we stop there? And there are a lot of other interesting things to say about him, but we'll do those next time, okay? Thank you.